Good morning. I'll give everybody a minute or two to settle in. Oh, wow. Was that a librarian who did that? I mean, that was very effective, I must say. I'm Mary Augusta Thomas. I'm the Deputy Director of Libraries, and I want to welcome all of you. So good morning and welcome. Nancy Gwynn, our Director of Libraries, is off, as some of you know, working on the institution's new strategic plan today, as is Anne Van Camp, the Director of Archives, and I suspect Ann Spire, the CIO of the institution. Anne, and Nancy are responsible for bringing you this series, this lecture series, which we said this morning does not actually have a title, but is the continuation of something we started last year, bringing in people sort of on the cutting edge to give us their thoughts and help us think through many issues. Today is the second in the 09 series. The third will be December 11th. Keep watching your Facebook, Twitter, Yammer, and the calendar because we'll be posting more information as the next event comes up. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dan Cohen, who will be introduced by Martin Kalfatovic, the library's Assistant Director for Digital Services, and to welcome you all this morning.
It's my ode to Henry Gibson, our late departed. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan Cohen here to the Smithsonian, and I have to pause for a moment, to Twitter that. And as you know, probably Dan is a very effective Twitterer, reaching thousands of people with his pronouncements and interesting news related to new media, American history, and other of the new things that he's interested in. Dan's currently an associate professor in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University, and is the director for the Center of History and New Media there at George Mason. His own research is in European and American intellectual history, the history of science, particularly mathematics, and the intersection of history and computing. He's the author or co-author of numerous publications, including Digital History, A Guide to Gathering, Preserving, and Presenting the Past on the Web, and also a more recent publication, which is Equations from God, Pure Mathematics and Victorian Faith. He also has done numerous articles or book chapters on the history of mathematics and religion, the teaching of history, and the future of history in the digital age. Dan received his bachelor's degree from Princeton, a master's from Harvard, and a doctorate from Yale. He couldn't seem to, I guess, find one school that he really liked. At the Center for History and New Media, which he's also co-directed in the past before taking over as director, he has supervised numerous projects, including the September 11th archive, and has been a leader in developing important new tools for humanities, history, etc., in terms of the new media things. The key one that I really like is Omeka, and he's worked with some Smithsonian staff on an Omeka installation, he and his staff. Also, importantly, is Zotero, which is a reference manager that you can just install on your computer and pull in resources and cite them and use them in all kinds of new and wonderful ways. In fact, Dan calls himself the chief Zoteran on his Twitter biography. Dan is also a very good friend of the Smithsonian. He participated in the Smithsonian 2.0 meetings that occurred earlier this year in January. He was also a reader for the Smithsonian Digitization Strategic Plan, and most recently, he served as a reader for that strategic plan. So it's, again, a pleasure to welcome here to the Smithsonian to talk about scholars and the Everywhere Library. Dan?
Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. And I really think it's great to be here to talk about this topic. I think with everything that's going on with the digitization plan and just overall strategic planning at the Smithsonian, I think it's an exciting time to be at the Smithsonian and to, if you're part of the general public who appreciates the Smithsonian, to think about the possibilities for the institution in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years. And I suspect, even though things move fairly rapidly in the digital world, that we are talking about that size of a project. There's a lot going on here. There are many libraries, there are many museums, there are many collections, and I think it's fascinating to kind of think through and go through some thought experiments, which is really what I want to do today, about what happens when you make this transition from the physical to the digital. And obviously, naturally, I'm a traditionally trained historian who was trained to go into dusty archives and find things and write about them on paper. And it's interesting to think about that process of just the scholarly process and what happens to that as you encounter new kinds of collections that may be still partially physical, but also have finding aids online and then ultimately scans online and other forms online, and to think about what we might do with that. So again, I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope, again, that we can have a discussion. I know we'll have ample time at the end of my talk, but you should feel free to interrupt me if you see anything objectionable or you want me to elaborate on any point. I'm happy to do that today. So my main point today, I think, will be this. What I'd like to say is that we are already in 2009 at a point in which few scholars use a single library or archive. Everyone is looking at things online. The browser has been probably for many years now, the entry point for scholarship. There are, of course, still cases where scholars have a very specific collection that they will visit and that their entire book or dissertation or article will be based upon. But in most cases, we are already searching for things online, plucking objects of interest from multiple collections. And if you can think about Smithsonian as an umbrella for multiple collections, which it certainly is, you can imagine the scholar coming in and grabbing materials of interest for a particular topic from multiple collections. It's that process that we're assessing at the Center for History and New Media, and I do want to say that there's over 50 of us there, and while I oversee it, really, almost all the work is done by my incredible staff, and they really, together, we are thinking about this process, and to address that process of scholarship in a digital age, we've done lots of things. We've built our own collections that we'll talk about. I'll talk about the 9/11 collection and what we might be able to do with that. We have built educational tools, learning modules for how you might use digital materials in the classroom. And we've also decided that we had to build software because we didn't find tools out there that were really made for the kinds of scholarly work that we thought we were doing and that ultimately everyone would be doing. And so we did end up building software, 2 major open source software projects. Everything we do is open access and open source. And Zotero is for the scholar, the researcher, and Omeka is for the content provider, which is a terrible word for it. Let's call them museums, libraries, archives, places that want to put content online in a way that's maximally accessible and maximally usable for the process of scholarship. So we've felt that we've had to cover this entire realm to address this problem, and it is a huge problem. And I think as the Smithsonian goes through the growing pains of addressing, how it will exist online, it will have to think through these very same problems that we've gone through. And so I hope I can be at least modestly helpful in sort of talking about some of the ways that we've addressed these issues. So what does it mean to do research across multiple collections? What I love about being in this realm is, the web, let's say, is 20 years old this year, right? 1989, the paper from Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the place where the Large Hadron Collider exists, the Center for Nuclear Research in Europe. It's 20 years old, and yet we exist in this realm where there are all these gurus about the web and social media gurus. I'm always followed by new media gurus, and I as a historian, I take a long view, and I'm sort of perplexed by the fact that we can address a 20-year-old medium and say that we're a guru on it. I think we're still really feeling this out, and I want to bring some skepticism into this talk today. As I go through it, I'll point out some places of weakness. So I don't think you should consider me to be a pure evangelist for this. Again, I'm really a pragmatist about it. I'm a pragmatist about what we can do in this medium. There are many advantages to it that we'll talk about, but there are some disadvantages, and I'll talk about those as well. Let's just, since I'm a historian, let's just start at the beginning here and talk about really what this transition means. And what I like to do is go back and just look at the history, the digital history here of the web. Here is Yahoo's homepage from very early on. I think it's 1995. And you can tell what happened here, right? In fact, one of their first hires was a librarian. And so what did Yahoo try to do? A lot of people don't remember this, but they tried to catalog the web. Categorize websites, put them under categories, arts, business, economy, etc. And so you'd go to arts and then and humanities, and then you drill down to that to history, and then you go from that to American history, and then to Civil War, and then to Bull Run, and all these things. And and someone at some point thought that this was possible to do, right? Which, I mean, we can giggle about it, but again, it shows you how difficult it is to reconceptualize this process of being a library or being a portal to research in a digital age. Right? There's no anticipation here of the exponential growth of the web or how the casual surfer or the intent researcher is going to address this. So we bring in a cataloger, we try to catalog the whole thing. Well, we know the history well. 3 years later, this launch, this is the 1998 first Google homepage, also rather comical in its design, although not much different than it is today. You can tell it came from Stanford and that it was done by geeks who like Linux because they have special searches on that. But this is already a rather large reconceptualization that I think it's, we should pause and take the time to appreciate what went on here. All of a sudden, we were talking about free-form, a full index of the web, a full text index of the web. So we've already gone beyond what librarians like to call metadata or descriptions about these web pages to just a full text search. Of course, there were other search engines out there, Alta Vista and Hotbot, if you remember these things. Google crushed them all through some rather savvy algorithms about how the web works, particularly the way it's interconnected, and that those interconnections form votes about what's important and what's not. But still, there is a reconceptualization here that maybe in a digital age, everything, since it's hooked up to the internet, becomes just part of an undifferentiated mass, and that most researchers will prefer to search across the entirety of it to find what they want. And they will not care as much as librarians and archivists and museum curators would like. They will not care as much about the individual locations or associations or affiliations of any of those collected items. They are going to just flit across these collections to find objects. And so this transition here from this to this means that, on this you would drill down, you would eventually get to the Smithsonian, get to a particular library, and go and look at that collection and search that collection's online catalog if there was one. When we get to here, we're just already making the assumption that we're going to dance across the various collections as we may. So the main point here is that we've already gotten a decade ago to the point where libraries and archives are not islands in a digital age. They are connected together. They are traversed brazenly by those unappreciative scholars. Right? And, we need to think more about what this means. And so, again, I'm going to walk you through a series of experiments, some real, some imagined, about what this everywhere library implies. For my research, this was really a revelation. This is an early experiment, it's already 5 years old, in which three very terrific historical collections of mathematics, really in the period that I'm interested in, were able to combine online. So they each have their own distinct collections, at Michigan, Cornell, and Göttingen. But they have been able to create a unified project, a unified search across these collections, so that when you search for, let's say, non-Euclidean geometry, you pull up these books from these scanned books from all of these sites at one time. Okay? Now, we could say this is just a time saver. It's rather nice that we don't have to go to these 3 separate sites. But you can see already, I think, some revelation here, right? Other collections could link into this to create a global unified collection of historical monographs in mathematics. There are potential search fine-tuning and other kinds of efficiencies that are gained by this process. And so in using this collection, I really found myself exploring the collection in a new way. Because I wasn't going to these individual collections and downloading PDFs of the books and then reading them in the normal scholarly sequence, I was able to think about, for instance, the spread of, let's say, non-Euclidean geometry in the United States, where it happened, what the publication scheme was on that, how many books were published in each year. It would have been much harder to do if I was just going to each collection, especially if I was doing that physically. I wouldn't think about these things, but I was able to prospect very quickly to think about how many hits I'm going to get in each of these areas, where the publications were, things like that. Okay, so here's one terrific example, and I think that all of collections, here's a fantastic collection that really all historians of the American South, particularly the antebellum South, go to UNC Chapel Hill to look at the Southern Historical Collection. This is their online site documenting the American South. They are in the process of digitizing, going through the same growing pain of kind of getting their stuff online. It will be a multi-decade effort because they've got a huge number of plantation records. It's really a collection of collections and actually extends beyond UNC. And they're thinking about how to put this stuff online. This is some of their initial attempts. And again, you can think about and look at the baggage of this process of going online. This is, by the way, not a criticism. I think they're doing incredible things at UNC, and they're really on the cutting edge in many respects. But I just to show you some of what they've gone through, one of the first things they did is put online their LC subject headings, their Library of Congress official subject headings for their documents. This is a very long web page. There's a lot of, you can see just on slavery, right? The LC subject headings are like the Dewey Decimal System. They extend out, right? So you start with slavery, and then you might go to a country, a nation state, and then you might go from that to history, and then a century, and then a social and cultural history, and then drinking and gambling, and you can go on and add these things up. But this is what scholars and I certainly grew up using a card catalog, and this is what we were trained to do. And so you can think about this baggage of, well, what should we put online? Oh, well, here's a finding aid, right? We've forgotten about that Google search box already in this process that everyone's used to, and it has so much power as a single box, and that user interface and what it says about the process of research in a digital age. Obviously, they figured out that this was not so helpful. And so, in fact, they powered their site by Google. You can get custom Google hardware or software to scan your site and do web searches. But you can see already we've run into problems here. And I think particularly for history, this is a huge problem. As we move away from the web, I mentioned it offhand before, but the reason Google search is so good, right, the insight that Larry Page had in PageRank, is that each link to another web page is a vote for that web page. So if a lot of web pages link to a particular site, and in that link it says Abraham Lincoln, Google figures out that if you want to know something about Abraham Lincoln, you should go to the site cited by those other web pages. So it's a reputational system. When you deal with flat archives that don't have hyperlinks in them, you are losing the possibility of having those connections. Now, WAGs in the audience will probably note that, for instance, books have footnotes in them, and in fact, Google is trying to mine that data as well. And that may be votes, but there's lots of things where you don't link to other things from within a document. And so it's very hard to figure out if I did a search on Booker T. Washington, what's the most important document in the 16 million documents of the Southern Historical Collection? That is a very tough problem for Google to solve. And I think that here is where scholarly institutions like the Smithsonian have a chance to really make a significant contribution to this realm of digital research, in that we do need to think about what the interfaces are, what the indexing algorithms are for presenting information in a way that scholars are able to find it. We need to think very carefully about the discovery process of the scholar. How do we search across collections? How do we find things of interest to us? These things are become incredibly complicated. They're much more complicated, actually, than a Google search, even though Google is dealing with 10 billion web pages. Those web pages are in some ways much easier to deal with than, let's say, the 130 million objects in the Library of Congress or the 2 million objects at the Smithsonian. So, we have to think about, what do we do with this process? They clearly thought through this and then decided, well, we'll use Google's related process, but these also don't really help out well. If you do a lot of these searches and click on, they added these little links for related documents, they don't really help out very much. So when we get to this point, this is where I'm often, criticized if people think I'm a cyber enthusiast, someone who just believes this is all great. Scholars will say, well, and in fact, I was at a meeting at UNC with a bunch of, I got criticized for calling them this, but analog historians, if I'm a digital historian. And those analog historians, without exception, all have that mythical story of the scholarly process. It was a warm, humid day in Chapel Hill. I got my cup of coffee. I went to the archives. I opened up this folio, and within it was this one document that formed my Pulitzer Prize winning book, right? And already I don't want to respond to that moment, except I do want to respond to it. And I've heard these stories from virtually every scholar has this. I had a professor at Harvard, Harvey Cox, who gave this great story about going into Widener Library at Harvard, and he was reaching for a book, and as he pulled it off, another book fell off the shelves and hit him on the head, and he wrote a book about the book that fell off the shelf and hit him on the head. And this, for me, is sort of that notion of serendipity, of scholarly serendipity that we all have, especially in physical archives. But of course, it blinds us to the fact that for every example of serendipity in a physical archive, there are countless other invisible examples where you miss something because it was stuck to the back of another document, or the archivist in England was fussy and wouldn't let you into the room to look at some cache of documents because, some lord didn't want their papers exposed. Or you weren't able to actually physically scan through the number of documents that was there. You have 5 days in an archive, you do the best you can, and then you go home, and you've missed something. So no one ever thinks about the hidden costs of being analog versus digital. And so I think we need to think a lot about that, and also to think about ways in which we can use this medium to create new forms of serendipity, to enable scholars to find things that suddenly they realize that they should know about. And we're thinking a lot about that in our projects, I think particularly the Zotero project that I'll talk about in a bit, with its online group collections and the way that scholars interact. But again, discovery in a digital age becomes very tricky, but I also think it presents really some tremendous kinds of possibilities. There is a computer scientist named David Mimno at the University of Massachusetts Amherst who has done some fascinating experiments with indexing digital collections, scholarly collections, for instance, of books. And what he's done is he's come up with a process called virtual shelves, in which he creates the experience of a shelf. So yes, you can go up to a screen and you're looking at a set of what should be a linear count of books. But he alters the shelf based on your research interests, so that, let's say you're doing research on the Erie Canal and you're an economist, he'll set up the shelves in one way. If you're a historian of culture and let's say of the culture of the Erie Canal, he will set up those shelves in another way. But you will still have the opportunity to scan on either side of, let's say, the book you're looking for, but you might come across other things. I think these are the kinds of experiments that need to go on, and I think scholars need to be part of that process of saying, you know, this is something of interest to me. This presents new possibilities for me. Okay. We have done archives ourselves, although I'm often criticized for calling this an archive because archivists say there's no provenance on this collection, our 9/11 collection, which was collected via the web, and they're right, but we'll use it in the colloquial way rather than the professional way, this archive. I want to talk about this archive because I think, again, this presents some important thought experiments about archives in the digital age, especially because this is a born digital archive. So this archive, which we did do, as you can see in the logo on the bottom, in alliance with the Smithsonian as well as some other institutions, is really a counterpart to the physical collections that the Smithsonian has on 9/11. And right after 9/11, we actually met with the Smithsonian and talked about this process. They were already getting calls from people who said, you know, I have a CD-ROM of photographs, or I have other digital objects that I want to give to them. Meanwhile, after we set up this project, we actually started getting physical objects. So we had a nice exchange program going on. But this was a project that we did in concert with the American Social History Project in New York. They sort of focused on the New York side of things, and we focused on the Washington side of things and on some of the technologies here. And I think this, again, provides some interesting examples. So what we did is we set up this website to collect digital materials about 9/11, that anyone could come to the site and contribute to this collection. And, you know, again, it shows you how hard, in the baggage you have, how hard it is to think about what you might collect and how you might present it on this site. So initially, when we set this site up, and I don't have the original design, which I did, and is really horrible because I'm not a web designer. But when you look at that design, all we had was stories, which was a big box that you could type in what happened to you on 9/11. We had a box for pictures, and we had a box for email. And it was sort of the only thing we could consider. Well, right after we launched this, people just started hacking our site. They started uploading artwork, Photoshop artwork that they had made. They wanted to upload video, audio. We were contacted by people who wanted to dump in their BlackBerry communications that they had saved. We had all kinds of things. We had someone write to us and say, well, can you archive my blog? And we hadn't thought about that. There are all these blogs. This is in the very early years of blogging. And sure, blogs were really fascinating. If you were a historian, and again, we were trying to do this thought experiment, what would we want in 50 or 100 years that we need to be proactive to capture? Because this digital stuff will get deleted, right? Blogs will go away. They won't be anywhere unless we kind of save them and archive them in some way. We ended up getting 3,000 blogs through this site. We thought we'd be happy with 1,000 or 2,000 objects, digital objects. We ended up getting 150,000 digital objects in the first 2 years before we turned over a 146 gigabyte hard drive that was about the size of a matchbox, and to the Library of Congress for preservation. And it was from 30,000 people, individuals contributed to the archive. And I think just there's something fascinating. You know, this project is often compared to, for instance, oral history projects. And there were some very traditional oral history projects, really the gold standard of these kinds of histories, say at Columbia, which went out, and they have Columbia Oral History Project that you probably know about, went out and did 300 interviews, really in-depth interviews, sat down, transcribed them, etc. We relied on this sort of hacked-together website to gather stuff, and there's certainly a lot of junk in here. It is not the high quality of the 300 interviews, and we didn't have a chance to kind of question people and ask for more information about something. But there is something about scale. There is something about having 30,000 stories versus 300, in that we're able to find things in that size of an archive and a fully digital archive that you might not be able to find in a paper archive or an archive in the scale of hundreds rather than tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Let me give some examples, and then I'll show you some eye candy. When we looked at the logs a couple years later about the way in which researchers were coming to this archive, so rather than contributors, researchers were coming to this archive, we were really struck by how poorly we anticipated, as the collection maker, how the general public and scholars would use this collection. The best example I have is, well, let me give you two examples. One is that there was an entire study done about what cell phone use was like in 2001. Because about 25% of the stories mentioned cell phone use. So all of a sudden you had an archive where social scientists who were really interested in cell phone use was just sort of spiking at that point. So it's really a snapshot. It had nothing to do with 9/11, really. Right? We thought this was a site about memorialization, right? About social and cultural history of tragedy, right? But here's someone who comes in laterally and quite brazenly who studies this as an archive about practice, of social practice with cellular phones. We had nearly 200 linguists come to this site and use it to study teen slang. Because we had so many, what happened on the one-year anniversary is that a lot of high schools mandated that their students write their own stories into this archive. And we had a lot of teen slang in this archive that people were able to use. This is also 2001, the rise of texting language, and before texting language, really instant messaging language, so LOL and all that stuff. And so there were linguists who were really interested in kind of modern American teen language who were able to use this archive for that purpose. And we've got lots of other examples like this, but you can see already what's happened, that in the process of putting something online, you really can't anticipate ahead of time. Right? If we had created the equivalent of the Library of Congress subject headings and said, well, here's what we think the categories of research are, right? There's no way we would have had a category for teen slang or history -- United States -- 21st century -- technology -- mobile phone use or something like that, right? We would not have come up with that. And so it's only in the process of a full search, which we had on the site, across the collection, that scholars were able to conceptualize and execute entirely new questions. And that was very powerful when we realized that, looking at our server logs, that we needed to put up collections in as open a way, because if they're not open, you can't do these kinds of full-scale searches, and in as flexible a way as possible to allow for new digital research possibilities. That if we pigeonholed it, if we put too much of an imprint on this online collection, or said that we're going to keep the stories totally separate from the email, totally separate from the voicemail, etc., as indeed we had originally had, where they were silos unto themselves, then people couldn't have done this full-scale research and couldn't have come up with the answers to their questions. Let me just provide one more example about this. Well, actually, let me wait. I'm going to bring this up as we get to more advanced forms of digital research. This is the word that Roy Rosenzweig, my dear colleague who passed away a couple of years ago, used for this problem, though. A big negative as we get to collections like our September 11 Digital Archive is just the problem of abundance. I mean, really 150,000 objects is not that much. And you can imagine collections that are far scarier to the historian. So the example I like to use is White House emails, which have proliferated. We don't have the stats yet for the Bush years, but the statistics from NARA, from the National Archives and Records Administration, is that just on the main email server in the White House for the 8 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, there were 40 million emails. Okay? 40 million email messages. So they're about 25 kilobytes each. That's 1 terabyte of email text. And that's, if you're a presidential historian, that's a scary thought. And it really requires you to think about, well, I need new tools. How am I going to look through this? How am I going to find anything in 40 million emails, right? And so Roy thought that there was this problem of abundance in an age of digitization and of digital research. And I think he was spot on. I think, how do you handle the everywhere library? What are the strategies that we can come up with to reduce the number of things that we're going to have to look through? You can no longer do what the presidential historian was trained to do, which is to go to the archive and sequentially read all the memos and take notes and write a book. Right? We can't do that with the record of Bill Clinton's White House. We won't be able to do that with any presidency from here on out. And the number of emails will just proliferate. So, one of our answers, as I mentioned at the start, is, here's just another example of the abundance. I mean, Google Books, they're in the process of digitization. This slide is a year old. They're actually, I think, rapidly approaching 10 million volumes on their way to 15 or 20. Here's another example that, how do you deal with this massive number of objects to scan through? So Zotero is one of our projects that we have used to address this problem. And it's a project where we literally sat down and said, we, as scholars, are sitting in front of the web browser for the first stage of research. And how are we going to create the kinds of personal collections that are the equivalent of my old photocopies from the archives that I went to in Britain and Ireland and America for my book Equations from God? How do you recreate that experience? How can you pull from multiple sites? How can you index it? How can you search it? And we felt that we needed a tool that was really embedded right within the web browser. We looked at other tools that were out there, like EndNote, for instance, which was a standard, from the 80s application that you double-click on your desktop and it launches an application and you take notes within it, while your web browser sits in another window and you kind of go back and forth between it. And we thought that we needed a tool that really operated right within the web browser and that recognized when you're reviewing a scholarly object within the web browser and could offer to save that object for you into your personal collection. So, so this was the problem, right? We had all these windows, we had handwritten notes, we had perhaps a desktop application like EndNote, you had Word documents, and you had your web browser, and these were all separated. And we wanted to just squish this all into the web browser, which we did because of actually the open source Firefox web browser came out at around that time and had tremendous possibilities for extending it. There are thousands of extensions to Firefox. And so we conceptualized Zotero as an extension of Firefox. It's actually much more than that now, and you can access Zotero in multiple ways, including within the web browser. But the main client or software piece that started this all off was a Firefox extension. It still is, actually, and that's how most people use it. And what happens when you click on the Zotero logo in the bottom right of your web browser is it pulls up an iTunes-like environment from the bottom of your web browser. That includes, this is an interface, by the way, that we brazenly ripped off from iTunes. It's an interface that's very successful. They're called Miller columns. There's a principle of going from general to specific, from left to right in computer interfaces. Bless you. So we have collections on the left, including My Library, which is every citation you've ever grabbed, every document you've ever grabbed. Sub-collections, when you click on a sub-collection, you pull up references, books, and articles. From that, when you click on an object, it gives you, we didn't want to be too librarian about it, so we didn't call it metadata. We just called it info. Also takes up less space, fewer pixels. So it pulls up info in the right pane. we leverage semantic computing, which is a kind of new area in computational science that is able to look at what's going on in the web browser and pull out metadata, pull out information about that object. If you think about the web, Web 1.0, it's about presenting documents online, right? Getting documents online. But they're really just presentational, right? When you go to your online library catalog and look up a book record, it presents you the information about that. Okay? What we wanted to do is be able to actually extract information from the page, right? Knowledge that's embedded within the page in many cases. And we were able to do that by sort of watching the web page be drawn on the page. Zotero actually interprets the web page as you are viewing it. And in this case, we're on JSTOR, which is the indispensable online digitized journals for scholars. And so in this case, it's a little washed out on the screen, but it recognizes that it's looking at an article here about Hamlet. And when you click on that icon in your address bar, it saves the information, saves a PDF into your interface. And we use a series of semantic algorithms and other kinds of algorithms to pull stuff off the web page. If you're on Amazon, it'll realize that you're looking at a DVD or a book. If you're on the New York Times website, it'll realize you're looking at an article or a set of articles. And it can save one or all of the objects that are on the page. As we've gone along, libraries and museums got into the act and started creating Zotero-compatible websites, which you can do not through our technologies, but by actually using standards that are broadly available on the web for making metadata available in an invisible fashion on the page, but a visible fashion to software. Again, we work with thousands of sites. We can't name them all, and it grows every day. And every day we ship out automatically new site compatibility to all Zotero users. This creates what I like to call fluidity of bibliography. So all of a sudden, you're no longer having to retype citations. And I know this is a kind of time saver, but there's also something that happens, again, in this, by making it so frictionless. Right? It's really simple, for instance, to grab some citations. You can actually produce reports that you can post on a website. So here's if you replace the HTTP with Zotero, : / you're actually able to put up a web page with a report of things you've read, let's say on Shakespeare. And those reports are Zotero compatible and also have standards embedded in them. So it's very easy to grab citations, post them back to the web. You can actually drag and drop within Zotero to other places. So you can take a citation from Zotero, drag it into a Google document online. That citation will be Zotero compatible. Someone can come along, or your colleague can come along, grab all the citations from a Google document, or you can drag it to a blog post or to an email client. It will automatically format that in whatever citation style you want. And so we've just increased the velocity of all this library information that was siloed. We can grab it from anywhere. We can send it back out to anywhere through the hub that Zotero represents. What's really nice here is that there's a kind of virtuous circle that happens when you think about these kinds of digital research possibilities. If people adhere to standards and we get some interoperability between sites, really neat things happen. Like here's WorldCat, which is the big online catalog, sort of umbrella catalog that's run by OCLC. And they created something which I really like, WorldCat lists, which are sort of curated bibliographies on various topics. You can create an account, pull things off of WorldCat and present it. And they knew about Zotero, and they embedded some information on WorldCat lists that makes them Zotero compatible. So if you go over to WorldCat lists and you're looking at their Shakespeare lists, you can see that there's a gold folder on the top, and through one click you could grab an entire list into your Zotero collection. So all of a sudden this process, right? And so now others are encouraged to also do this embedding and also to allow for the free exchange of scholarly information on whatever site you're on through these standards, through interoperability. we also, I think, have tapped into another area of our current digital world. We've talked about ad hoc personal collections and how powerful they are. But there's also this aspect of social computing. Twitter is one of those aspects. Facebook is probably very famous in social computing. We have, in a kind of 2.0 version of Zotero, leveraged this ability to share maximally through our server. What I like to do on this is to talk about how much you can share. And I like to do this thought experiment. So we've talked about sharing citations. But Zotero collects a lot more than that. It's the full research process from the beginning conceptualization through publication. We actually have plugins for Word and OpenOffice and other word processors. And so we are collecting within Zotero the entire scholarly process in a way that wasn't happening before. And we're collecting it in a very shareable way. So this includes things like notes. This includes tags. So you often hear this, which is the application, the personal application of keywords to your research. So you might want to tag a bunch of things, non-Euclidean geometry, so you can search back to that. And also people have used Zotero, for instance, to rank objects. So there's people who actually make value judgments about the importance of particular objects in their library. We're collecting all of that within Zotero. By the way, you don't need to share if you don't want to. We're just encouraging it. So what are we collecting in that process? And the example I like to use is just to think about one set in the Library of Congress. There's 1 million dissertations. There's 131 million objects in the Library of Congress, 1 million of which are dissertations. And you think about everything that went into those dissertations and what was left behind in the act of printing it out into double-spaced, standard 300-page documents. Right? Those documents have a lot of other information other than the narrative, right? It includes footnotes and bibliography. Those are helpful. But let's think about all the work that went into it and what we've lost in just grabbing really what's the tip of the iceberg, right? What's left over at the end or what's visible at the end of this huge scholarly process. So the average time to write a dissertation is 4 years. There's about 2,000 work hours in a year with a 2-week vacation. I always like to discount the graduate process. Having been a graduate student and having graduate students working on dissertations, I know that you have to just chop off about 1,000 hours. Coffee drinking, twittering, these sorts of things. Okay, but still, let's say 1,000 hours of actual work over 4 years. That's 4 billion hours of dissertation research went into this one collection in the Library of Congress. That is a huge, huge amount of human computation. That is a bunch of people assessing what's important, pulling things from various archives, taking notes on those things, right? They are creating bibliographies through those sub-collections in Zotero that may never see the light of day because they changed topic or their ultimate bibliography didn't use some documents. But they were there. They looked at them. That might be of interest to other people. Right? So we have lost all that. And it often sits in filing cabinets, frankly, in paper filing cabinets in professors' offices. So if we could operationalize that material some way, then we could gain quite a bit of new information. Right? This is a lot of scholarly information that is lost that we can think about regaining digitally. So we have a server now that is available. If you go to Zotero.org, you can download the 2.0 version that includes access to the server. And within just a few weeks of launching the server, we already had over 5,000 scholarly groups of every conceivable interest: natural sciences, social sciences, humanities. You can just surf through this, and there are dozens of scholars in these groups, or in some cases hundreds of scholars in these groups, and they are all sharing their materials through our server. They've all got their local collections on their server, on their computer, but they've also are creating things that they're sharing, things that they have found. So we've aggregated a huge amount of scholarship through this process by just thinking through the scholarly process and then making connections online. We have bibliographic feeds, so you can actually, if you don't want to use Zotero, you can just actually subscribe to a group as an RSS feed in Google Reader or something like that and find new references as they come through. APIs is just a fancy way of saying that other software developers can come in and use our server or our client software to extend it in any way they want. We're completely open source, and so it's very easy for others to kind of come in and attach things to it or use our information. We have a recommendation system that's coming up that will be our attempt, I hope not feeble, but our attempt to try to make some serendipitous connections for you. To say, hey, I see you're doing some work on the rise of non-Euclidean geometry. Here are some things that other Zotero users have saved to their collections that might be of interest to you. So we're taking this very powerful social computing platform and leveraging it for discovery, for digital discovery, because we're assuming that the power of the crowd is more impressive than the power of, let's say, a Google algorithm, a straight text mining algorithm, or a Library of Congress subject heading listing. So here's our creative lead at the Center for History and New Media, Jeremy Boggs. So he has followers and people following him, and he shares his entire Zotero library online, and it's really wonderful. If you're interested, he's a fantastic web designer. He thinks a lot about technology and history, and you go to his Zotero page, and you can just grab whatever you want from his collection. He's made it fully available. He's really categorized it nicely. He even has all of his dissertation documents out in the open, as you can see, about 2/3 of the way down his page is working on a history of technology dissertation, and he's made that stuff fully available. And when I hear gasps when I talk about this to a scholarly audience about I'm going to lose my research to someone else, I always think this is a complete red herring. I mean, maybe it's because I wrote a book on 19th century pure mathematics that very few people have read, but most academic monographs, trust me, there are not hundreds of people out there prospecting around to take your research on that topic, and besides, you're far along in your research anyway. So I think this point about holding it and being secretive is a little bit too much academic self-importance and paranoia, if we can call it that appropriately. There are other forms of social computing beyond us. I'll just also mention that we've got lots of other things going on with aggregating documents. So if you scan in documents that are public domain, we're about to launch an Internet Archive interface. It's actually available in the most recent edition of Zotero, but we've hidden it because we're road testing it. So don't turn it on. I won't tell you how to turn it on. But it is baked into the software now, and this will provide the ability to drag documents that you want into a public commons at archive.org, the Internet Archive, which probably a lot of you have heard about. So if you're, let's say, an archaeologist and you have 10,000 photographs from your dig in Athens, either during your research or when you're done, you can just drag that collection into it, and it will be preserved at the Internet Archive in perpetuity, all those digital photographs, and will be made searchable for everyone to use. So we're creating our own commons using this system. So we'll talk a little bit more about some crowdsourcing possibilities that I think are kind of interesting for the Smithsonian. And we talked about crowdsourcing quite a bit at this Smithsonian 2.0 meeting this past spring. The one I really like is this one. It's Galaxy Zoo. And what this is these are professional astronomers who are using the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So there's a huge set of digitized images of the sky. They've chopped them up using computers into small sectors. And then they've realized, I think quite shrewdly, that astronomy is one area where there are a huge number of amateurs out there who know a lot. In fact, a lot of comets, as you probably know, are discovered by amateurs, not professional astronomers. And so they decided to kind of leverage that community because they had hundreds of thousands of galaxies that they were interested in studying, but they didn't know, well, which ones are interesting, right? They want to find interesting forms, galaxies that are colliding, galaxies that are going supernova, galaxies with black holes in the center of them. And they realized it was impractical for a single scholar to kind of sit down and leaf through hundreds of thousands of sky survey images. So they created this site. I think it's actually great that they named it Galaxy Zoo, not something more academic. And it's kind of a game. And there have been thousands of people who have come to this site. You sit down, you register and log in, and it shows you a little part of the sky and says, well, what does this look like to you? And you do this human assessment of it. So does it look smooth? Does it look something else? I suspect they're interested in the ones in the middle, features or disk, probably the most interesting to them. And people go through and catalog these hundreds of thousands of galaxies for the astronomers. I think at last count they've done 250,000 galaxies using this process. And it's really just tremendous. And, I think about the Smithsonian. There are a lot of collections in the Smithsonian where there are similar communities that would love access to this material, probably know a lot about various things, Hummel dolls, Civil War artifacts. Civil War is one of those areas where there's tremendous amateur knowledge that can be leveraged. Right? There's all kinds of areas where you can imagine sites like Galaxy Zoo adding to the discovery systems that you set up here so that people can find objects that they might be interested in for their research. I did a little experiment a few months ago doing precisely this, and where I just put this image up on a board in front of a crowd in New York City. And I also tweeted it at the same time. This is my own little crowdsourcing experiment. This is an object from a 19th century anthropological journal. I'll tell you the story in just a second. And from a young anthropologist who found this object in the Midwest and brought it back to Washington because he had no idea what it was, and went to the Anthropological Society of Washington to kind of ask his colleagues, do the 19th century version of crowdsourcing, to figure out what this was in this dig that he did in Illinois. So I sort of tried to replicate this in a digital age by putting this up. I put it on my blog. You can read about the full outcome of this and also the process a bit on my blog. But I threw this up and then I tweeted. I said, look, I've got an image on my blog. Take a look at it, and you have 30 minutes, my followers on Twitter, to figure out what this is for me. So do the 21st century version of what this guy did in the late 19th century. So it took 9 minutes for, at that point, I think I had about 1,600 followers to figure out what this was. And it was just incredible. I actually had behind me on the screen just the scrolling discussion online of these 1,600 people. And there were anthropologists who came in and pointed out, well, there were 2 holes in it. It was a necklace, so it's something worn around the neck. And then there were other people who came in who were specialists in Native American religion and realized, there's a spider on there, and they talked about what the spider meant. And then there were others who came in and said, well, which tribes had spider iconography, and people started doing digital research for me and pointing out various books online where you could find spider iconography. And they ultimately completely figured out what this was in 9 minutes. That actually impressed even me. I'm kind of jaded, but it was a kind of a fascinating exercise that, I have an unusual community in that I've got a lot of professors following me, and I'm lucky enough to actually have a few followers. And so this would be tough to do without a lot of followers. But again, it's just an exercise in what we might be able to do, right? And certainly the Smithsonian, in their Twitter accounts, has a huge number of followers. The American History Museum does. Library of Congress does. There's lots of institutions that, could have Artifact Day, Artifact Wednesday, and post something and have people figure out what it is. Or do something like Galaxy Zoo, where you could crowdsource a much larger archive. So that's the interesting part of the story. So the person who found this was William Henry Holmes. Does anyone know that from Smithsonian history? Right? Okay, he was a young man who was a curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian when he was in his 20s. And he then went to the Field Museum. He returned to the Smithsonian and actually became the head curator of the Department of Anthropology in 1897. And then he became the director of the National Gallery of Art in 1921. But he was he was a fascinating figure. He was, I think, very smart to kind of use 19th century crowdsourcing on this material. And it ended up that this was it was buried in a hill in St. Clair County, Illinois. And it was made out of shell. There was a tribe in that area that had, I have somehow flipped on something here, that had ceremonial shell insignias. What's interesting about this is that it's in the upper part of basically the Mississippi Valley. And what was unusual about it to him was that this shell clearly came from farther down in the Mississippi Delta or somewhere like that. And so it's a ceremonial shamanistic shell. It was worn around the neck or usually right around the throat like this. It's part of a earth cycle practice. There's circles which have to do with the circle of life and things like that. I don't have my full notes on it. You can find out the full story again at dancohen.org. But it was from a tribe, and I guess that they had acquired shells through trading with other tribes farther down the Mississippi. So it also was, I think, really fascinating for him because he realized that there was significant trade and trade routes in this area that he hadn't realized existed. Where was I? So I think that social computing and crowdsourcing, they're often belittled because I think when we think about crowdsourcing, we often think of Wikipedia and the problems of veracity and these sorts of things. But I think there's ways of doing it. These are a couple examples where there are self-correcting mechanisms. And actually, if you looked on my Twitter stream for this, people were correcting each other and saying, it couldn't be from here, it could be from there. And as long as you had enough activity, you could really correct for problems of error. Let me talk about, finally, some further possibilities. And this is, I think, farther down the road. So we've talked about creating discovery systems, about presenting things online in ways that present new forms of digital research. Computational scientists, computer scientists, have been doing this for decades, right? I mean, there are people at IBM and Google who have really fancy ways of mining through lots of data, finding things, visualizing it. But I think a lot of these methods are still really immature for history and the humanities and the arts, right? I mean, a lot of these objects don't present themselves very well for the kinds of algorithms, as we just discussed before, that all those math PhDs at Google are interested in. But I do think there are some really interesting possibilities that we can think about what a scholar might be doing in 5 or 10 or 20 years once we have a mass of materials online that is open, that can be mined for new information. Here's just one example from Brigham Young. Mark Davies digitized Time Magazine from 1923 to 2006 and OCR'd it, so transcribed the text out of those. And so he's got a corpus or a collection of about 100 million words from Time Magazine. And this is a really fascinating site. He really put it up as a linguist. So linguists could study changes in language over time. I think it's fascinating as a historian because you can do these incredible searches for topics across Time Magazine. Here's a search on race relations. And shockingly, it's almost a perfect bell curve around the civil rights movement, which peaks in the 60s, of course, in the Johnson administration. Now, what's interesting is the pattern, right? So what I think is interesting in doing digital research is searching for patterns, but also anomalies are interesting. So here we have an anomaly of the 1990s. Can anyone figure out what that is? Why there's a spike in discussion of race relations in Time magazine? What? O.J. Simpson, yeah, the aftermath of the O.J. Simpson trial in the early 90s. So again, thinking ahead 100 or 200 years, a historian would want to come to a collection and be able to do a kind of bird's eye scan in this way. And then actually Mark has, I think, done a terrific job here. It's very easy to actually then drill down into specific documents. You can see, oh, boy, what happened in the 1990s? Right, we know what that is, but someone in 100 years might not. And so they could very quickly go down to the level of the scan by clicking on these lines down here in the lower right. So it's easy to do, and this is one of my main points today, to combine close reading in this way with what Franco Moretti, a scholar at Stanford, literary scholar, has called distant reading, which I guess is a nice way of putting it. Right? We've got the distant reading up top, and we've got the close reading possibilities below. I think what scares a lot of scholars in the arts and humanities and social sciences is that we're going to lose in digital methods the traditional methods of reading something really carefully. And I'm a firm believer that we will not lose close reading, but we need methods for discovering documents that we want to read closely. We did this with 9/11. We've really been thinking about ways to mine and visualize the information in the 9/11 archive. We have, we started off again with the baggage of how do you present a lot of information, and we viewed it just like we viewed all archives. Well, you pull a box off the shelf and open it up and leaf through it. And so our initial interface for research was literally browsing through. So here's our photographs section, and you leaf through it, right? Which doesn't really make a lot of sense. We've since done some experiments. We did this experiment with mashing it up with Google Maps, where we took images and stories from 9 a.m. on 9/11, and using some services, there are digital services that will help you geolocate or place on a map images or text stories based upon metadata or based upon text from within the story. So they'll take, 9th and Broadway and be able to map that very specifically for you. So we ran through some of our collection and posted it onto a Google map. And this, again, presents a new way of, well, let's look at the cluster of people in Chinatown or who were in a specific building. We can do that very rapidly. Think about how long this would take if you were looking at a physical archive. You'd have to go through by hand all these objects and then look at them and, draw on a map where they are. And in this way, you can start having, people who are experiencing the same thing from different angles or who are on the same subway car. You can find all these people very quickly and do, again, new kinds of prospecting. Since we have an internet connection, which I wasn't expecting, I'll go to this live and just show you a final example of this. So here's our same collection. This is our 9/11 collection. We've taken the stories and we've done text mining. So again, we've had a computer scan through for specific keywords, and then also sent those, packaged up those stories and sent them to Yahoo's service for geolocation so that we could locate where these stories were taking place. I'll just give two examples. They're a little tongue-in-cheek. Let me actually flip off one first. Okay, so let's just look at these red dots first. So these were, again, we have thousands and thousands of stories of what people were doing on 9/11 from all across the world, actually. We've just taken here the American stories. We've geolocated them. And these are stories of people who said that they were praying. So I had the computer look for variations on the phrase praying or I was praying, things like that. And then we've put them onto the map. And the thought experiment here is the historian of religion, let's say American religion, who is interested in what religious practice was like in 2001 and wanted to look particularly at, let's say, more evangelical forms of religion or prayer forms of religion. Well, you can look at this collection and really zoom in and look around at different areas. I haven't done something here that should be done, which is to normalize the data, and we can talk about that in the discussion period. It's very easy to look at various areas, and really what I noticed doing this thought experiment is that you very quickly come to the conclusion that prayer is a suburban and exurban phenomenon. And in fact, if we had an overlay, and actually you can go to Google Earth and get various overlays to overlay on this overlay. So you can look at, for instance, megachurch construction in the United States and evangelical practice in the United States. And it correlates very closely with these things. What I find fascinating is the godless urban core of America. Whereas you go from city to city, Atlanta's the same way. In the downtown we don't have a lot of stories of prayer. Let me pull back here and go up to godless Boston, where I'm from. But it's really even the same place in the here. We'll just zoom into. Actually, let's zoom into Washington since that's where we are. So here's Washington, and we've got a bunch out here in Northern Virginia. Only one story in Montgomery County. Recently moved from godless Montgomery County to Northern Virginia. But you can really get a really interesting kind of overview of American religious practice, again, in a way that you wouldn't be able to do with a physical archive. Just on the tongue-in-cheek side, I like to overlay people who are watching CNN. So these are CNN viewers. And they are actually in the godless urban core. So there's a... here, let me go back to... I don't know why the New York Times is showing up. You can see in Atlanta, right? It's showing these zip codes here. Let me turn off the sidebar. Austin, no prayer, just CNN viewers. Dallas-Fort Worth, remember? There was nothing in the center. Okay, now obviously I do this in a semi-comical way to entertain audiences, but I do think there's something here about the possibilities. And we wouldn't have gotten this research possibility with 300 stories. We would have gotten something else with 300 stories of gold standard oral history, but we wouldn't have had this possibility. So I think there are some really fascinating possibilities coming up with doing this kind of text mining, visualization. Again, we could go from here, actually. I haven't set up... Oh, actually, no, I haven't set it up on this. But I have set this up before. We can link back to the specific story. So you can go in, go from this, again, literally, in this case, bird's eye view, over to specific stories, read through them. And we could do this for anything. This took me a couple of hours, but now it would take me 30 minutes. So I could do this for cell phone use, right? Or some of these other... I'm sure you're thinking about research topics right now that you'd like to do on this, right? And it's only possible because we've digitized it in a particular way. We've made it fully accessible to other digital services like geolocation services, visualization services, in this case Google Earth. It's trivial to have the archive spit out a file called a KML file, which Google Earth reads, and then you can just start looking around inside of it. So, so this is certainly a possibility. Now, there are problems, and I want to end on a note of skepticism. And this is one that some of you might have heard me talk about before. So this is actually one of the most famous visualization projects, which is the Many Eyes project that comes out of IBM's labs. So you've got a lot of computer scientists there. And this is their visualization of the Bible, the Christian Bible. And what they've done here, if you can see, is they have the sizes of the circles are by the importance of the characters in the Bible. And, you know, as I like to joke, it comes up with the astonishing conclusion that Jesus was important in the Bible. Now, you know, I have been criticized about this, and people say, well, there's lines between the characters, which has to do with how many scenes they show up in together. But I just present this as a kind of opportunity to say, you know, there need to be experiments. Maybe there is something here. I don't know. But we need to think through what these research possibilities will look like. What are helpful visualizations? What are visualizations that just state the obvious? Right? So there's a lot right now going on in digital research to try to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of this. Because you often do run into, and I would, in an attempt at self-criticism, say that some of that visualization in the 9/11 collection is obvious. It might not be obvious in 100 or 200 years, but it's certainly obvious right now. So we need to think about ways in which, again, just to review, we can present new serendipitous materials to people. We can allow them to search across collections and create ad hoc collections. We can allow them to take what they found and visualize it, to think through it, to scan through it in ways that might provide revelations. And again, I think we are just at the beginning of this process. So, the folks at Many Eyes have self-congratulated themselves about this visualization several times. It's shown up in the New York Times and other venues. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's why, in some sense, the Smithsonian may be behind on digitization, but I think we're still ahead of the curve in terms of what can we actually do with this? What do scholars actually want out of this? What does the general public actually want out of this? So I think there's lots of possibilities there. I think the best thing to do is to do the kinds of things that we try to do, which is experimentation, prototyping, small-scale tests like we've seen here. And I think that in the process of doing those things, you really make a lot of realizations about problems that are real and problems that are fake. For instance, we didn't have a lot of fake stories in our 9/11 archive because it just, people who want to do fake stories, there's other places to do that. And I think also with the Smithsonian insignia there, the Library of Congress insignia, people came to that site and took it very seriously. So we didn't have a lot of problems with some of the things that you might worry about with this kind of crowdsourcing. Why don't I stop there? I realize that I've overextended and it's already 10 of noon, and I want to leave some time for questions. But thank you very much. Yes. We've got, since we were webcasting, please wait for the mic.
Well, thank you very much. It strikes me, because you're right, I was thinking of a research project as I was looking at your 9/11, that one of the things, though, that you have is you start out with a large digitized body or a natively digital body. If you want to then take that and go to the Civil War and say, did people go to churches after something happens in the Civil War, how are we going to get to that point?
Right. Right. So as a historian, I do worry about this. First of all, not everything will be digitized, ever. I think actually a lot of the collections I've looked at in my life will probably never be digitized. So there's that problem. You at least hope for finding aids to go online. So there's that piece. I think a big problem we have right now with, let's say, pre-20th century material, even moving beyond just the born digital material, which is great because it's already scanned, it comes that way, right, is handwritten materials are highly problematic. OCR software doesn't really work right now on handwriting, although there's a lot of work being done on handwritten materials, and it's going to get better very rapidly. But I think here is a case where we really rely on other people who've gone through the collection to say what's in those letters. So, I mean, let me go back to just the Zotero example. And really, when we were conceptualizing Zotero, I was thinking about my collection. So I've read every letter that George Boole, the creator of Boolean algebra and Boolean logic that's at the heart of computers, I've read every letter he ever wrote, which is, I'm not tooting my horn. He didn't write that many for a Victorian writer. They tend to write a lot. But so I have a bunch of notes on what's in those things. I don't have a transcription, but I basically created my own finding aid for that. And in the 90s, I had no way of sharing that. But I could share that online. And I think there's going to be a lot of examples where you're going to have to aggregate notes, tags, these sorts of things. I think in that case, it's going to be incredibly complicated. For the Google Earth version, I think you're going to need a transcription. And there's a lot of experiments going on right now with crowdsourced transcription. We're looking into it we have an archive of really the first 15 years of American history, the papers of the War Department. is on our site at wardepartmentpapers.org, where we've scanned in 50,000 letters that came out of the War Department, which was basically the entire federal government for the first 15 years. We don't have enough money to go through and transcribe it. But we think that there's enough people out there, amateur enthusiasts about the early republic, who love seeing a letter from Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, and would be willing to go through on a split screen environment where one side is the high quality scan and another side is a wiki that we'll set up that they can type into to transcribe these materials. And to verify them by doing this across, having multiple people work on them at the same time. So there's various computational methods for verification as well. But that's probably going to take a long time for those 50,000 letters to get fully transcribed. Yes. If you could just wait for the mic, maybe we could pass that down. Or
what I wonder about is now and the future. By that I mean if a researcher now wants to look at the letters written by Chekhov or a scientist or something, he has paper to look at.
Right.
I'm talking about unpublished material. How do we know now if we have some budding genius who's 20 years of age and is just writing emails back and forth to friends or whatever, that it'll be lost?
Yeah.
And 20 years from now, we will say, gee whiz, we wish we had that stuff, but we don't have it. Is there any thought being given to that?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Yes, I mean, there is thought given to that. And the Internet Archive, which is our partner, really has been doing the most thinking about this. Brewster Kahle, who created the Internet Archive, said, I think quite famously, that somewhere in the archive that he created, so they do just to expand upon, if you don't know what the Internet Archive does, they crawl the entire web, or what they can access, about every 30 to 60 days. They have 2 petabytes of storage to do these web caching. So, and you can go to archive.org, and they have something called the Wayback Machine, where you can go back in time and look at sites as they looked, and that's where I pulled those screenshots from. And they just have everyday sites from normal people. He likes to point out that, Brewster Kahle likes to point out that somewhere in that archive are the papers of a future president. But how would you know in advance, right? You don't know when they're 13 and they put up their website on skateboarding that will be a future president. And so his feeling is you just got to go out there and get it while it's available. That was our feeling too, is that archivists, librarians have to be proactive because this stuff goes away. It raises a larger problem, doesn't it? Which is part of the problem, actually, that I have with closed services like Facebook. So right now, we've got a whole generation that is texting each other or emailing each other within Facebook. And I'd much rather have them do it on the public web or participate in public ways that can be archived by services like the Internet Archive or the Library of Congress. Because surely we are going to lose stuff that is in gated areas like a Facebook. Okay? Or on commercial services. Actually, when we launched the 9/11 project, we got these emails, I remember very early on, from people who had done a lot of discussion about their feelings on Yahoo forums. And Yahoo made the statement that because of their storage restraints, they were going to delete all their forums after 6 months. And so on March 11, 2002, there was this outcry that they were suddenly going to delete all of these recollections. Now, Yahoo ended up actually saving that stuff. But there is a real problem here about where stuff resides. And I think if you're history-minded, you need to think very carefully the ways in which you participate, right? I mean, if you use if you use services where the stuff can't be extracted from it, then you will lose your history, right? That stuff will be lost. I use Gmail, like a lot of people, which is a web-based service, but I archive all my email separately, and I archive it in a format that is universally accessible. It's a very basic format that pretty much anything can read. Not that I think I'm going to be a future president. I'm sure I'm not going to be a future president, but I just want that stuff to be available. And so if you look in Digital History, the book that I wrote with Rosenzweig, which is available for free online, although you're welcome to purchase a copy, in paper. Chapter 8 of that book talks about this, about what you might want to do yourself if you want to be sure that your records will be archivable. And there's basic practices. In fact, much of it Roy and I learned just from talking to archivists, that apply both offline and online. So documentation about what's in something, let's say you burn a DVD-ROM, using standards that are, again, universally accessible. So it's always better to have something in plain text than to have it in Word, 2007. There's a lot of things that come up related to that issue, and it's complicated. We kind of go about our merry digital ways without thinking about the past. So there's a consciousness that I think people are going to start to have about that they'll be losing all this material. A lot of what we have, that I have as a Victorianist, is what archivists call preservation by neglect. So they were letters, Boole's letters, that were stuck in a shoebox, in some cases quite literally. And then someone finds it in their attic a couple of decades later, or a couple of generations later, and goes to the Bodleian or some other preservation body and says, oh, I found these things. Well, it was lucky that it was on paper, and it was in a shoebox, it was dark, and it was, basically climate controlled, but there's, there's the equivalent of that in the digital age of what's your shoebox. And I do worry that we're surely losing a lot right now as we speak.
Thank you, Dan. You've given us a lot of food for thought and some great eye candy as well. I just actually wanted to put in a plug for your, and to say thank you for your Digital Campus podcast.
Oh, thank you.
They're great, and keep it up.
Okay, thanks. And I should point out again the collaborative effort with Mills Kelly and Tom Scheinfeld, digitalcampus.tv. If you're interested in these issues, it's something that we just talk in a freewheeling way, we had a little summer hiatus, but we're back recording. We're recording actually tomorrow morning again for our 44th podcast. So thank you very much for the plug. Yes. Okay, I've given you too much to think about, so I think the questions are over. Thank you very much again for coming and listening. If you have specific questions about your own personal preservation regimes or something like that, I'm happy to address them off the mic and off the webcast as we finish.
Thank you for coming this morning. Thank all of you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.